Go ahead.
This is the third of my brown bag presentations, focusing on the long sequence of decorated ceramic types produced by the Northern Tewa Pueblo potters, who have long resided in areas of the Northern Rio Grande. While the first two talks discuss changes reflected by the different Tewa whiteware types defined for the period spanning from the 10th to the time of the Spanish colonizers. This talk will focus on the sequence of Northern Tewa decorated pottery types defined for a period spanning the 17th to the end of the 19th century, mostly based on observations from sites in and around the long-occupied provincial capital city of Santa Fe. The sequence of occupation in this area include a long reign of Spanish control, a very brief period of Pueblo revolt and independence, and the inclusion of this area as part of the countries of Mexico and then the United States. Ceramics at sites along what was the northern New Mexico frontier are reflected by long enduring traditions of Pueblo pottery. There is no doubt that the Spanish were almost completely reliant on locally produced Pueblo pottery. The shared ratio between Pueblo types to Old World or European pottery forms at excavated contacts from the palace of the governor in Santa Fe, dating to the early colonial period, is 800 to 1. Similar trends continued even after the Spanish colonial period until the end of the 19th century. This partly reflects difficulties in bringing pottery and other exotic goods across the long and dangerous El Camino Real trail that connected Mexico City to Santa Fe. Also, unlike many other areas of the Southwest, along this part of the northern Spanish and then American frontier, there was no need to bring in craftsmen producing forms of wheel thrown or other technologies associated with Old World pottery forms. The general lack of a trend to produce or acquire through long-distance trade exotic pottery forms such as Morocco, porcelain, or stoneware in the New Mexico colonies appears to have directly resulted from the availability of large amounts of pottery long produced by Pueblo potters in widely spread and distinct communities. The production of this pottery is represented by a series of long and established uh, traditions, resulting in a wide range of durable and attractive pottery forms to seek both the needs of indigenous and communities, as well as newly arrived officials and colonists. Ceramic data documented in areas occupied by the Northern Tewa and surrounding Pueblo groups just prior to the Spanish colonial period foreshadow trends documented for later Northern Tewa decorated forms. This includes changes reflected by the production of distinct biscuitwares that developed out of earlier Tewa whitewares such as Santa Fe, black and white, as well as the glazeware types produced by Pueblo groups over broad areas to the south. The area over which Northern Tewa tradition pottery types were produced shrank significantly through time. By the period just prior to Spanish colonization, the production of Northern Tewa decorated wares was limited to a few Pueblo villages in the Tewa Basin, most of which are still occupied. The manufacture of biscuitwares gradually transitioned to ceramic forms classified as sankawi, black on cream, noted in context dated to the last part of the Classic and first part of the Spanish colonial period. This type exhibits characteristics transitional between the late biscuit wares and early historic polychrome types. Forms include large bowls with steep walls and evenly shaped, long-necked, wide-mouthed jars with long shaping necks and sharp curves along the lower body. Designs are executed in organic paint and resemble those noted in earlier types that became but that become increasingly sparse and opening with widely spaced thin parallel lines filled in with zigzagging or angled lines along with attached dots, ticks, and triangles. The use of materials and techniques long reflected in the production of Sankoe Bacon cream allowed for a distinct and visually effective combination of traits that resulted in large, well-made vessels with compact, self-tempered paste decorated with black organic paint and applied over a highly absorptive slip that fired to cream to tan colors in oxidizing atmospheres. Many of the characteristics that appear to be continually reflected in Northern Tewa decorated pottery produced during subsequent periods. Observations and illustrations presented are mainly a result of my involvement in the analysis of extremely large numbers of Pueblo ceramics recovered from archaeological sites in the Santa Fe area dating from the early Spanish to the end of the American Territorial period um, during investigations by the Office of the Archaeological Studies. As according to Spanish decree, at the time the Spanish capital was moved to the then unoccupied location that is now the Palace of the Governors. This location, however, does overlie ancestral Tewa villages dating from the 10th to the 15th century that are all still considered to be important ancestral sites by northern Tewa Pueblos. The capital at the Palace of the Governors was located in an area surrounded by villages associated with distinct Pueblo groups and languages, some of which produced very distinct forms of decorated pottery, while pottery and assemblages dating to the colonial period also include large amounts of undecorated utilitarian as well as glazeware vessels produced in Pueblo villages to the south. This lecture will focus on trends noted for Northern Tewa Bacon cream and polychrome wares, given this is the third of several talks discussing trends noted for these wares. In assemblages from the Palace of the Governors, dating to most of the 17th century, pottery is represented by a mixture of Tewa decorated micaceous and plainware types as well as glazewares. A range of glazewares exhibiting paste and tempers indicative of production in villages scattered across different provinces and areas of the south slightly outnumber northern Tewa decorated site types at most proveniences dating to the Classic period. Northern Tewa decorated ceramics associated with the initial colonial period occupation at the Palace of the Governors closely resemble forms produced during the preceding period prior to the Spanish arrival that had been assigned the Sankoe Bacon cream. While the great majority of the pottery assigned to this type represent ball and jar forms resembling that described for assemblages dating to the pre-colonial period occupation. A few examples noted in early colonial period assemblages exhibit characteristics and decorations previous resembling those noted for earlier Sankoe black on cream and are also represented by a few examples exhibiting forms that resemble European style soup plates. The occasional presence of such forms seems to foreshadow a long sequence of Tewa decorated forms reflecting both previous established Tewa pottery manufacturing and decorating norms, as well as form and styles geared to increasing numbers of Spanish, Hispanics, and then Americans living in the northern New Mexico frontier. The stylistic transition reflected by pottery assigned the types assigned to both zirconia, black on tan, and polychrome include the addition of a red slip for some examples that were often applied to rims, as well as the exterior underbody of shoulder bowls. Pastes tend to be hard and compact, reflecting firings at higher temperatures. While designs resemble those noted in Sankowi, black on cream, there is an increasing emphasis and elaboration of solid triangles. Other design motifs include parallel, intersecting and curved lines, diamonds, stepped and hooked triangles, and cloud motifs. The subtle changes in designs may ultimately reflect symbols of Pueblo identity and expression that became more important during the initial stages of Spanish colonization. The appearance of Sakona polychrome and then Tewa polychrome seems to represent a merging of styles and conventions characteristic of Sankowi black on cream and Sakona black on tan, earlier produced by Tewa potters, and influences from glazed wares produced in the Middle Rio Grande. The common use of red slips, often combined with lighter colored decorated slips associated with the shift to the production of Tewa polychrome types during the late colonial and Pueblo Revolt period, indicate the adoption of styles and forms commonly used in glazed polychrome forms assigned to Coyiti polychrome that began to be widely produced during the early colonial period. During the Pueblo Revolt, lasting from 1680 to 1692, Pueblo warriors temporarily retook control of their homeland, during which Spanish officials and colonists were forced to retreat southward. The different Pueblo groups that participated in the revolt formed villages that had been characterized as refugee sites located in highly defendable places. With the Spanish retreat and their initial abandonment of the palace of the governors, some Pueblo leaders took up residence at that location, where a multi-storage Pueblo structure was constructed over the existing building. The further elaboration of organic painted polychrome forms that include influences from potters who produced glazeware vessels is represented by the widespread production of Tewa polychrome that appears to have been first widely produced during the Pueblo Revolt. While most of the surfaces of examples assigned to Tewa polychrome are covered with broadly applied red slips, the decorated surface is also covered with thinner banded areas consisting of a lighter colored slip over which decorations and organic paint were applied. The lighter slip is either white or buff and consistently overlaps the red slip, indicating the red slip was applied over the lighter slip in contrast with techniques used in the decoration of other Pueblo polychrome types. Tewa polychrome vessels are remarkable for their stylistic uniformity, their hard and durable surface, and large, well-shaped, aesthetically pleasing vessel forms. Forms are dominated by large bowls, but also may include smaller hemispherical bowls, soup plates, and jars. Tewa polychrome shoulder bows exhibit sharp, well-defined angled keels. Jars are often large, exhibiting flared rims, long necks, and sharp keels along the lower portion. The painted designs, while displaying some elements of earlier types, are characterized by small, distinct, and well-executed lines and solid designs. Design elements reflect the combination of parallel lines and dots noted in earlier Tewa decorated types. Common motifs include cloud and key-shaped elements, as well as isolated and connected triangles with flags or hooks, commonly separated into panels by vertical parallel lines in a manner resembling that noted in uh, just prior produced glazewares. Other influences from glaze painted pottery also seems to be reflected in other Tewa Pueblo pottery forms. While there is a long sequence of various red slip pottery forms having been produced in regions to the south, the increasing importance of plain red slip forms, such as Tewa Red in northern New Mexico during the colonial period, appears to have been directly adopted from glazeware vessels. In earlier colonial period assemblages, this is reflected by the large-scale production of distinct soup plate forms that seem to conform with some descriptions of San Marcos glaze on red that often exhibits very sparse and sometimes faint decorations, often limited to just a few dots or, in the rim area. In fact, some glazewares, such as this soupe from Pecos Pueblo, closely resemble forms commonly assigned to Taylor polished red, except for the associated tempering material and the presence of just a few spots of glaze paint along the rim. The appearance of polished red ceramics and assemblages dating to the early colonial period appears to reflect a mixture of body sherds derived from glazewares, those from early red slip vessels, and examples exhibiting paste and temper indicative of Taylor polished redwares that continue to be common during later periods. A related development is reflected by the production of pottery assigned to Tewa or Capo Black, sometimes during the early colonial period. Smudge pottery forms had long been produced in areas to the south, and many of the utility wares that began to be produced just prior to the colonial period were often intentionally smudged on the interior surface. Whatever the source of inspiration, by the 17th century, Tewa potters were producing pottery characterized as Tewa black, defined by a hard, highly lustrous black, intentionally sooted surface applied over a highly polished red slip. Both the look and hard, impervious surface may have made such forms desirable substitutes for some European forms. Following the end of the Pueblo Revolt, the palace of the governors was rebuilt and reoccupied. By the start of the 18th century, Pueblo losses suffered during the revolt and reconquest periods were followed by a long wave of colonists, mainly from Mexico, that resulted in a Hispanic population that for the first time surpassed in numbers that of the Pueblos. The earlier large haciendas with constant demands on native labor were replaced by small, self-sufficient farms. The Pueblo and newly arrived colonists seem to also have been further united by increasing outside threats from groups that may have included the Navajo, Apache, and Comanche. By the very early 1700s, glazewares were no longer produced, partially as a result of the Spanish abandonment of areas such as partly result as the Pueblo abandonment of areas such as the Galisteo Basin that had earlier produced mass amounts of this ware that were widely traded. The cessation of production of glazewares also seems to have been fueled by a Spanish decree against Pueblos having access to materials that could have been associated with munitions that prohibited their access to earlier used lead mines. At many of the pueblos previously producing glazewares, there was a shift toward polychrome forms, decorated with combinations of iron and manganese-based pigments that included stylized feathers and other symbolically significant designs. Middle Rio Grande and Western Pueblo polychrome ceramic types are rare at assemblages from the Palace of the Governors and surrounding sites dating to the 18th century. Assemblages associated with the first three quarters of the 18th century are overwhelmingly dominated by a combination of pottery forms produced by northern Tewa potters that include organic painted Tewa polychrome, as well as Tewa plain and micaceous utility ware types. Together, this combination of pottery forms provided for a range of cooking, storage, and serving activities that were conducted both within Hispanic and Pueblo households. The distinct combination of characteristics resulting from the merging of conventions earlier associated with northern Tewa polychromes, as well as Rio Grande glazeware vessel forms to the south, resulted in new and effective strategies and recipes, allowing the mass production of, of aesthetically pleasing, highly polished, and durable pottery forms with less time spent on the application of painted decorations. While continuing some earlier Pueblo aesthetics and qualities, the emerging pottery forms also resulted, at least in part, to a similar look to that associated with some European forms that may have made them more desirable to Hispanic and Spanish consumers. Next in the sequence of Tewa polychrome types discussed here is Ogopoge polychrome, which refers to a very rare and distinct group of pottery distinguished from other polychrome types defined for the Tewa series by the addition of red painted designs. While timeline-wise, it seems to be transitional between Tewa and Pahoki polychrome. The overall style is quite distinct from either. Rims and the very portion of the jar are covered with a thin red slip. Designs are executed in a combination of black, organic, and red mineral pigment that can be red slip pigment that can be quite elaborate. It may include stylistic feather motifs where the tips are often filled with red. Such designs appear to have derived from the previously mentioned Keras and Western Pueblo matte painted polychrome types. This type appears to be extremely rare and short-lived, which may reflect a lesser need for forms with traditional decorations in a market that seems to have mainly been geared to Spanish and Hispanic consumers. The next trend is reflected by assemblages, often dominated by what are usually very small bowls and soup plates. Bowls exhibit red slip uh, along the rest, with the rest of the interior covered with a cream colored slip and simple designs covering much of the rest of the decorated surface of the vessel that appear to be indicative of Pahoki polychrome. The earliest forms noted for this type may be distinguished by the presence of more traditional, although usually simple, designs that appear to have developed out of Tewa or Ogopoge polychrome. It has been suggested that from the late 18th into the first 19th century, there was a series of changes associated with a distinct economic system in northern New Mexico that was oriented around innovative or dominating Hispanic settlers or vecinos. These changes influenced the relationship between Hispanic consumers and Pueblo potters during the late Spanish colonial Mexican and early American Territorial periods. Despite the flow of American goods that began to go through the Pecos Trail from 1821 to 1880, the great majority of pottery at sites across much of northern New Mexico during this time still reflect forms produced by northern Tewa potters. In some cases, at settlements located a further distance away from Pueblo villages and along the margins of the vecino system, simple undecorated Pueblo-like pottery forms also began to be produced by Hispanic potters. Other groups, such as the Hickory Apache, also seem to have adopted and produced some pottery, including micaceous utility wares. But even at Hispanic sites along the northern and northernmost Hispanic frontier, where simple forms appear to have been produced locally by Hispanic potters, Pahogi polychrome vessels exhibiting characteristics indicative of production by northern Tewa Pueblo potters is usually still present, often representing the dominated decorated pottery form. Northern Tewa ceramics continue to be produced and distributed over wide areas under Spanish domination in areas of northern New Mexico, as well as during the time after this became part of Mexico and then the United States, until the introduction of the railroad system that allowed for the transportation of huge amounts of American goods. Like the previous periods, sites of all kinds in the areas within and immediately surrounding the Tewa Basin are dominated by Tewa polychrome, Tewa plainware, and Tewa micaceous utility ware types. The main difference in ceramic assemblages associated with this period is the presence of similar Pahoki polychrome vessels, which were by far the most common painted pottery sites found in both Pueblo, Hispanic, and even sometimes American sites in the area discussed here for sites dating from the late 18th through most of the 19th century. Painted decorations on Pahoki polychrome vessels were applied in organic paint over broad areas, slipped with a thick and sometimes crackled light buff to cream colored slip. This slip usually covered almost all the interior surfaces of shallow bowls and the upper three-quarters of the exterior of jars. Vessel forms and overall surface finish and range of forms resemble that noted in ceramics assigned to slip red and smudged plainware types from the same context. Until the late 19th century, forms are dominated by shallow bowls and soup plates that tend to be very small, particularly as compared to those associated with both earlier and later period sites. Jars at these assemblages also tend to be quite small. In Pahoki polychrome, earlier small and more precisely executed motifs in thin decorated bands were replaced by large bow geometric designs that cover large portions of the vessel field. Design motifs tend to be large, covering most of the slip surface, and overall execution is simple in terms of overall shape, thickness of vessel, as well as associated designs. Painted decorations are distinct as compared to those noted in earlier Tewa tradition pottery types and reflect gradual changes in decorative conventions. Designs consist of bold geometric forms that may cover the entire vessel but are sometimes divided into bold segments. Decorations consist of wide panels formed by thin single or double lines. Designs appear to have often been strongly influenced by those used in contemporary Western or European forms such as Mo'olaka. In some examples, a series of checkered or radiating triangles or diamonds may have covered most or all of the painted surface. Design motifs may be combined into medallion, floral, shield, or coat of arms patterns. These designs may consist of single elements or combinations of relatively simple elements. There are notable differences in pottery forms from archaeological sites discussed here, dating to the late 18th to the first 3/4 of the 19th century, described during this talk as Pahokee polychrome, as compared to the original description of this type by archaeologists such as Mara, Chapman, and Harlow, as illustrated by examples shown here from the School of Advanced Research Vessel Collections. This is the result of the original discussion of this type having been based almost exclusively based on often elaborately decorated large storage jars or deep bowls, in contrast to the small open bowls, soup plates, and occasional small jars typical of forms from archaeological sites. These earlier descriptions of Pahokee polychrome were largely based on vessels collected or purchased during the late 19th and early 20th century. Most of the Pahokee vessels are assumed to represent forms produced at about the same time as these collections were made, although some may have been in use for some time before their collection. Some of these vessels seem to have been initially collected to serve as a model for a revival of Pueblo pottery to remedy a perceived decline resulting from production previously discussed that, that was geared to Hispanic villagers, as well as a burgeoning tourist market for knickknacks that was beginning to take place at that time. Chapman, during his extensive discussions at Tewa Pueblo pottery, noted that older large Pueblo polychrome storage jars were still in use at some pueblos during the early 20th century because these vessels may have been less subject to breakage. These large and often nicely decorated vessels were taken from the corners of seldom used storage rooms by early collectors. Using examples from collections acquired in this manner, Chapman and others based their study of black on cream pottery mostly on jars that would now be classified as Pahokee polychrome. Most of these Pahokee polychromes are assumed to represent items produced at about the same time these collections were made, although some of them may have been in use before their collection. Some of these vessels seem to have. It also appears that the production of these more elaborately painted jars may have also been partly spurred by the arrival of increasing numbers of Americans transported in mass by the railroad during the late 19th century. A very limited but interesting view of this new market is provided by vessels such as the one shown here, recovered from trash deposits associated with the reuse of Fort Marcy privies during the late 19th century in the downtown Santa Fe area, excavated by the Office of Archaeological Studies. The beautiful decorated is somewhat lily fired and badly eroded jar recovered from trash deposits at Fort Marcy, shown here, is among several that may reflect new techniques and aesthetics geared to the arrival of American tourists. Other variations of forms produced at different Tewa pueblos that were spurred by the tourist trade during this time include the brief and presumably unsuccessful production of flower pots, as reflected by this Tsuki polychrome form. The discussion of the myriad of new northern Tewa Pueblo pottery types and forms that began to be produced at different pueblos at this time and subsequent periods is beyond the scope of this presentation, but represents an interesting and important chapter in the long history of pottery produced at Northern Tewa villages. Thus, there's a lot of vessels from a lot of collections and a lot of sherds from sites and test pits from around here that we still need to examine and ponder before we can fully understand the nature, dynamics, and reason for changes resulting in the interesting and beautiful vessels that continue to be made and appreciated. Often the top layers, denoting the more recent components around here, seem to be characterized by painted and paintwork pottery types derived from large soft jars with exhibiting new shapes and decorated styles that can be assigned to a number of new northern Tewa types, spurred by both the tourist trade and a new wave of experimentation and creativity. That's it.